Welcome to The World on Fire. I'm your host, Greg Wilpert. In today's interview, we're going to take a bit of a departure from my usual discussion of current events. That is, I will be discussing a topic that I studied as a graduate student in sociology when I focused on critical or left social theory. That is, today we will talk about how some leftist theories and theorists have been and still are being co-opted by the dominant political economic system. We will do this by focusing on one particular representative of this type of theorizing, the philosopher Slavoj Zizek from Slovenia, a relatively small country in Eastern Europe which used to be part of Yugoslavia. In 2012, the magazine Foreign Policy listed him as being one of the top 100 global thinkers, and has also been called a celebrity philosopher, mainly due to his countless appearances at conferences, talk shows, and even in films, despite the fact that he calls himself a communist. But could it be that he is famous precisely because he is a communist that the establishment can live with? I will be exploring this and related questions with Gabriel Rockhill, who recently published an extensive critique of Žižek for the online publication Counterpunch. Gabriel is a professor of philosophy at Villanova University and founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop. Thanks for joining me today, Gabriel.
Thanks for having me on, Greg.
So let's start with why bother with such a critique of a fellow philosopher. Apparently you are doing this as part of a larger book project on what you've called the global theory industry. Talk about why you're engaging in this takedown of Slavoj Zizek. What motivated you?
Well, I think it is important to begin with the larger context, which is a book project entitled The Intellectual World War, Marxism versus the Global Theory Industry. And the focal point for this book project is the relationship between Marxism as a science rooted in the collective struggle for human emancipation. That has, of course, a deep, very broad history that we don't need to go into here, but that has had a theoretical tradition that arguably has had one of the single most important impacts on the practical world. And that I juxtapose to a certain brand of radical theory that is extremely widespread within the capitalist world and has been really pushed to the forefront in the kind of neoliberal conjuncture. And it's a form of radical theory that sometimes refers to itself as Marxist, or at least draws on Marxist or Marxian inspirations. While at the same time, if you read through all the details of what these thinkers do and also look at their practical impact in the world, meaning look at it objectively speaking, then a different story begins to emerge. And that is the story of a group of thinkers who I am now referring to as radical recuperators. So they appear radical, they say very often inflammatory things, they're usually critical of capitalism or certain aspects of capitalism. But their fundamental social function is to recuperate potentially insurgent segments of the population, most generally kind of young people and students, and to recuperate them within the anti-communist fold. And so part of this research segues with some of my earlier research into the history of the US national security states' support for what the CIA called the compatible left. Meaning a left that might be radical and anarchist and even say that it's anti-capitalist, but at the end of the day would be compatible with the fundamental agenda of the capitalist and imperialist powers. Within that, I wasn't originally going to include Žižek, but it was at the encouragement of some of my friends and fellow activists who made a very good argument to me that Žižek is important to engage precisely because he has such an enormous platform. He's not just an intellectual, he is a cultural icon of sorts. He has movies made about him. You know, people outside of the academy are much more likely to know the name Žižek than they are the name Derrida or Rancière or some of the other figures that I deal with in the book. And so it's with that in mind that I decided to kind of dig into the work and the political practice of a figure whom I had been reading since his very first book. I remember when it came out and I remember reading it. So this goes way back to my college years, really, as an undergraduate.
Let's actually take a dive into Žižek's work. Now, I want to talk about it in three parts. The first, his political background in Slovenia, then his rhetorical strategies and arguments, and finally his claim to be a Leninist or communist. And then finally, I'd like to conclude with another brief look at how he fits into the larger global theory industry. So first off, Tell us about Zizek's political background in Slovenia. He was politically active there before he became famous. What did he do and what did he stand for?
Yeah, I think there are at least two elements to foreground. One is that theoretically, Žižek was oriented towards the cultural and intellectual production in France, and in particular, the kind of neo-Heideggerian movements in France, meaning those intellectual developments that were drawing on the work of Martin Heidegger, who your viewers and listeners probably know is a famous unrepentant Nazi. In fact, Žižek's very first book was on Heidegger, and he provided the first Slovenian translation of the work of Jacques Derrida, a French thinker who, amongst other things, played a very central role in rehabilitating the reputation of Heidegger, which, of course, had been tainted because he had been a Nazi during World War II. And so that theoretical orientation meant that instead of, because Žižek grew up in a socialist country in Yugoslavia at the time, instead of focusing on Marxism or historical materialism in general, he instead was oriented towards these Western cultural and intellectual projects. And this segued directly with his political activism, which is the second element that I wanted to highlight. According to his own description, he was part of the anti-communist dissident movement that was influenced by both French theory and in particular Heidegger, right? And we shouldn't forget that long-standing historical opposition between Nazism and communism, and the fact that this dissident movement would be influenced by Heidegger would reveal some of its Nazi proclivities, at a minimum at the intellectual level, but potentially also at the practical level. And within that framework, one of the things that Žižek did was he was the weekly columnist for a dissident magazine, meaning anti-communist magazine, entitled Mladina. And that magazine had a very, very wide readership and was part of the movement to dismantle socialism within Yugoslavia. And the Yugoslav Communist Party did a very detailed study. I haven't read it myself because I don't have the language skills to do that. But within this detailed study, they came to the conclusion that the Central Intelligence Agency was funding Mladina. This wouldn't be surprising given the number of operations that the Central Intelligence Agency funded, because it was perfectly in line with their orientation. Moreover, Žižek then not only was involved in this dissident movement and the attempt to overthrow socialism in Yugoslavia, but then he proceeded to co-found the Liberal Democratic Party and serve as its first presidential candidate in the first elections that took place after the dismantling of socialism. And the Liberal Democratic Party took a very strong position in favor of dismantling the socialist apparatus of the state, orchestrating what Žižek referred to as quote-unquote planned privatizations. And another key quote from Žižek, and it's important, I point this out in the article that we're referencing, but this is in perfect line with the U.S. national security state, and more specifically, the politics of Ronald Reagan and what he was advocating for at the time in Yugoslavia. And that is, in the words of Slavoj Zizek, quote, more capitalism, in our case, would mean more social security. He also supported or at least provided limited support to the open society orientation of that is affiliated with, of course, the work of Karl Popper and George Soros. Soros is, of course, a well-known financier of anti-communist destabilization efforts and the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the Soviet sphere of influence in general. And not only, of course, Žižek in that case, he didn't win the presidential election. It was actually for a multi-president system, and he came in, I believe it was a very close fifth, but he proceeded then to support this same party that he had co-founded for, in his own words, the first decade after this dismantling of socialism. And we should remember that this was the party that then oversaw these brutal economic counter-reforms that destroyed the industrial sector, depressed real wages, dismantled the welfare state, were laying off workers at a catastrophic rate. And they were also, the same party was the leading proponent of accession to the European Union and to NATO. And we know in Žižek's later work, which I'm sure we'll touch on, he has been an outspoken supporter of Europe. In fact, he's on record as saying only Europe can save us, meaning apparently from the current capitalist and ecological crisis, there's only one savior, and that is Europe, and it seems more specifically the European Union, which is an extraordinary position for anyone who is a self-proclaimed Marxist to take, and also a very, very strong supporter of NATO. He's supported, in particular, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, and he also came out and is on record as criticizing Kissinger for being a pacifist, and has expressed his fulsome support for the U.S.-led kind of NATO proxy war that's currently going on in the Ukraine. So although he has this deeper past, you see very many threads of that, elements of that past that are still operative in his current political and theoretical positions.
Now I just want to turn now to actually some of his more kind of his writing in general. That is, he's a very prolific writer, writing at least one book per year, I think, for the past 30 years or so. And throughout his writing, he seems to enjoy saying outrageous things. And one of them, you mentioned in your article that he said, quote, Hitler was not violent enough. And the New Yorker magazine once also praised him as being the master of the counterintuitive observation, which is like something that he really seems to revel in. What do you make of this, his writing style and his so-called counterintuitive observations?
Yeah, he's someone who has a series of rhetorical moves that he's mastered, and rhetorical is actually being quite kind to him because they're so boring and trite and repetitive that it gets really old reading him. And one of the central moves that he makes is he sets up a situation where he leads the reader to think that X might be the case, and then he reveals a few lines later that actually it's not X that is the case. And he undertakes these kind of inversions again and again and again in his writing to such an extent that, and you can map this out, some people have in his writings, that he just self-contradicts. And so he's often very difficult to pin down, and that's, of course, on purpose. One of the things that I also point out in the article is this kind of charlatan-like approach to discourse, where you say something and then you, in this cheeky manner, rework it to reveal that actually you think the opposite, and then you think the opposite of the opposite, and you just kind of keep going down in these abysmal dark holes of rhetoric. One of the things that actually reveals is that a big part of his discourse is based on opportunism, so that he will say whatever he thinks the system wants or his interlocutors want or is provocative at the moment, might get some hits and likes. It's not very surprising at all, actually, to me that someone like Žižek would be a global phenomenon in a kind of era of the Twitterification of human consciousness. He's someone who operates very much like a kind of agent provocateur who wants to say, provocative things and always kind of be edgy, but do it in a way that the substance of what he's saying can always kind of be displaced, so he can't be pinned down. And the problem with that is that there actually is a very clear center of gravity, as I just mentioned, in his political actions. And that center of political gravity is one in which his anti-communism is very clear and his support of imperialism is very clear. And so what's interesting about his kind of the Dada dialectics, this kind of games that he plays, is that he'll play them at one level, but at a more substantial level, all of a sudden things will get quite serious. And so I think that maybe this is a time to connect what we're talking about to the title of the piece. I referred to Žižek as capitalism's court jester, and I meant it quite literally. What a jester does in relationship to the court is to say outrageous things that nobody else can say, to really toe this edgy line that might make people feel mildly uncomfortable, but is funny and can even be raucous. And I'll hand it to Žižek. At times he can be humorous.
I would like to agree with you, but my evil nature pushes me in the opposite direction. Of the heart, it's one of those nice, gentle French movies where you have incest, which is portrayed as a nice secret between mother and son. I like this. I think that our only true partners, the true leftists today, are modest, intelligent, honest skeptics, conservatives. This morning he provided the best, I'm grateful for it, the best definition of myself. He told me that he considers me a moderate conservative communist. My gratitude to you. Thank you.
But the whole point is not to push humor and satire to a level at which one would be given substantive knowledge about the real world or a real honest critique of the court of capitalism, but on the contrary, to kind of humor the puppet master. And that's precisely what Žižek does, and it's the reason that he's been so lauded and celebrated by the capitalist world, is because as he is saying all of these kind of provocative things, but at the end of the day, towing the anti-communist, pro-imperialist line, that leaves the rich and wealthy of the world to chortle in their martinis and hire him to write advertising for, you know, their publications, which is precisely one of the things that he's done, or hire him for movies or do other such things. And so he plays a kind of perfect role as this laughable clown who nonetheless is very useful to the capitalist ruling class. And from my vantage points, it's really important to point that out as well, because I have to admit I was hoodwinked by this huckster when I was younger, because I was uneducated. I thought that he was fun and exciting and edgy, and he didn't require the level of knowledge that, you know, historical materialism would require, or studying the history of capitalism would require. And so there's a way in which he is a quick and easy hook to bring in a lot of young people. And it's also for that reason that I wanted to make people aware of the fact that capitalism's court jester is just like a sugar-coated pill. You know, it might taste good going down, but watch out, because it's going to rip your entrails out, and it's going to be very, very bad for your health.
You said that he's kind of somebody who's very I forget the word now, accommodating, or somebody that the establishment would like, basically. What makes you say that? I mean, in what ways is he accommodating to the system?
Well, you know, he's on record as having said that communism, and he says more specifically, Stalinism, is the perhaps worst catastrophe of the 20th century at the political, moral, economic, every possible level. He has supported so many imperial interventions, and he has done it in such a way that he also is a major commodity producer, as you mentioned, with the rapidity of his book publications, but he's also a commodity hawker. He sells so many things, movies and art shows, and, you know, he's really one of the kind of golden symbolic values of a certain very niche, but nonetheless important sector of cultural production. And so if it be the capitalist ruling class and their interests in denigrating communism and supporting imperialism and capitalism, or if it be other segments of the kind of cultural apparatus within capitalism that wants to sell radical liberal theory at a very quick pace, both of these segments can and have used Žižek very well to their ends, and he's also used them to promote his own career, because there's a kind of phenomenon of uplift, if you will, where the ruling class that has the power and pulls the strings, as well as their elite managers in the culture industries who work for them, they provide uplift to those intellectuals or cultural producers who will give to the system kind of what it wants, something cheeky and edgy that sells well, but ultimately is, you know, pro-imperialist and anti-communist. And so it's there's a kind of mutually beneficial relationship between a charlatan like Žižek and both the capitalist cultural apparatus and then ultimately the political ruling and political and economic ruling class. And that's precisely one of the reasons he's such a dangerous figure. Right? He has a reach that extends well beyond the reach of most academics, or for that matter, even most intellectuals.
Mm-hmm. Now, all of this kind of seems to contradict one of his main claims, which is that he considers himself to be a Leninist and a communist, and on top of being a Marxist and a Hegelian and so on. But let's just focus in on this claim of being a Leninist and a communist, and he'll often, I guess, qualify this self-description in strange ways. But in what sense would you say? Does he mean that, or does he not mean that? What do you think he means by it, and how is this different from usual conceptions of the terms Leninism and communism?
Oh, he certainly doesn't mean Leninism as a Leninist would understand the term, or as most Marxists would understand the term for that matter. He is known for his cheeky provocation, right? Apparently he sleeps with a portrait of Stalin over his bed, and regularly invites journalists in order to see this.
His, of course, ha 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 ha. It means welcome to welfare, to socialist wealth. Good, honest guy.
And part of this is really him cashing in on his so-called street cred as an Eastern informant in the wake of the dismantling of socialism in Yugoslavia. And so he originally rose to prominence in the Western world as a radical Democrat who was anti-totalitarian, meaning anti-communist. And that was through the help of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, Verso Books, and a kind of particular clique of the publishing industry. But he very quickly, I think, realized that since he'd grown up in an environment in which Marxism was present and Leninism was present, he could use the symbolic value of things that were kind of in the air of the times to his favor. And so he began repackaging himself, no longer as a radical Democrat, which he is, if you look at his early books, it's quite clear, but instead as a Marxist, and then increasingly as a Leninist. And over time, that's clearly a marketing ploy that's based on this type of attempt to provoke his niche audience in the West, which is the kind of radical liberal audience. But if we look clearly at what he says about Lenin, it's remarkable the extent to which his portrait of Lenin basically lines up with the right-wing, extreme right-wing, in fact, fascist descriptions of what Leninism is. Leninism basically mounts to a ruthless seizure of power. And this is how Žižek explains it. And he explains it in this way, again, in order to provoke. You know, that he'll say kind of to get people, oh, we need more gulags, we need more bureaucracy, you know, all of these things. He'll take these negative liberal critiques of actually existing socialism and then redeploy them in this cheeky manner in order to get a rise out of people. But he says very clearly, in fact, I think I have the quote here, he says that he is not interested in repeating Lenin at all. The idea of a Leninist Workers' Party today would be a nightmare, you know, something to this effect. So he basically takes this kind of right-wing mythology and even liberal mythology to a certain extent about Leninism and does not pick up on any of the actually historically substantiated elements in Leninism, like the right to nations of free determination, you know, the right of all nations to free determination. Which is a central tenet of Leninism, was celebrated by Ho Chi Minh and so many of the anti-colonial revolutionaries around the world. And there are many other, you know, democratic centralism. There are many other aspects of Leninism that one could bring to the fore. And so, unfortunately, it's just it's a gimmick for him. Like most of the political practices that he refers to that are on the anti-capitalist left, these are just terms and concepts that he can redeploy for his own intellectual opportunism, and his own political record demonstrates that, right? If he was a Leninist, why was he the co-founder of a liberal party that was intent on dismantling socialism, introducing capitalism, and joining NATO? That would not be a Leninist orientation. He's also an Obama supporter. He was an Obama supporter, the drone chief par excellence and the deporter in chief and all of the other things that we know about Obama. And he advocated for and endorsed Donald Trump, right, in the more recent election. You know, as far as I know, there isn't another Leninist out there who's supporting Donald Trump in the U.S. election. So we see the level of his charlatanism and the ways in which it's also just a real disservice to those who have both studied and worked in the Marxist tradition and work not just intellectually but politically to make it just into this little gimmick. And that's why I refer to what he's doing as commie cosplay. It really is. It's like going and, you know, to some, party with a bunch of Wall Street bros and they're all on coke and one of them's dressed up as Lenin as a joke. You know, it's really cute and might get a rise out of your fellow Wall Street bros, but actually isn't that funny to the people around the world who are struggling for human liberation. But that's about the level of the humor of Žižek, and probably one of the reasons why there's more than one Wall Street bro who likely reads Žižek and likes his work.
Now, I just want to turn to kind of again, back to the context, the larger context in which Žižek fits in your project of looking at the global theory industry. So tell us a little bit more about what this larger global theory industry consists of, especially as it relates to left theorizing, and how Žižek fits into this.
Yeah, the book project that I'm working on looks primarily at the post-war era, and it focuses on the transatlantic relationship between Western European intellectuals and the U.S. national security state, but also the U.S. intelligentsia, U.S. journalistic world. And it charts out what I would refer to as a kind of counter-history of critical or radical theory, depending on how you want to call it, in the sense that instead of simply mapping out these histories in terms of their own intellectual developments internal to their debates, which is usually how most academics would tell this story, right? Where it would be somebody intellectually responding to someone else's ideas, developing them, departing from that, etc. Instead, I look at the materialist foundations that are driving the promotion of certain forms of theory. So it's a kind of political economy of knowledge production. Why is certain knowledge being funded? Why is it being promoted? Why is it circulating widely? Why is it being translated, etc.? And a big part of that story has to do with US-driven propaganda endeavors in the Cold War, which is, of course, the old war and still continues today. In the new Cold War, it's the war on communism. And so that research has led me both to kind of unearth the early architecture of Cold War propaganda that was aimed at shoring up the compatible left, as I mentioned earlier. And one key element, Thomas Braden, who was one of the CIA operatives who was very central to this entire operation, stated this himself quite straightforwardly in an article that he published in, I believe it was a Saturday Evening Post, and it's called I'm Glad the CIA is Immoral. And he says that the only people who gave a damn about fighting communism in Europe were the socialists. What he meant by that were the social democrats or the kind of radical liberals. And those people found themselves funded and supported, often in sub rosa or clandestine manner, by the Central Intelligence Agency, but also by other propaganda agencies and other elements within the US national security state and the UK national security state, for that matter. And that overall architecture led to a whole series of important developments like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, other similar organizations that were operative in Great Britain. And so I won't go into any detail on that, but what I'm interested in is I outline that architecture, but then look at its consequences in the kind of neoliberal age. And what you see in, the 1970s and 80s and following is an enormous explosion in a kind of radical liberal theory emanating out of France, but also there's some that comes out of Germany and the Frankfurt School that is promoted as being the most kind of dangerous theory available. It's contestatory, it's insurgent, and that theory, in an interesting way, is promoted within the capitalist world, and it's a theory that I was trained in. It's the theory that I was drawn to because I thought it was the most radical and most dangerous theory. So as someone who comes from a farm background and working class, I thought, well, I want theory that actually has use value for human liberation, so I'm going to go and study this stuff. Lo and behold, after studying it very closely, I realized that that was not the case at all, that one of the things that almost all of these theorists share is a propagandistic orientation that is quote-unquote anti-totalitarian, so they're against actually existing socialism with only very, very few exceptions, the majority of which can be explained if we go into the details. And many of them are very strong supporters of imperialism in various ways. And so the history of that book then is looking at this early architecture, but then also focusing more specifically on the kind of global theory industry as it's really developed in the neoliberal age, as a way of shoring up this compatible left and these radical recuperators so that people who are educated in institutions, at least in the global north, but of course there's a colonial dynamic that has an enormous impact on the global south in this regard, tend to think that, well, Marxism is either beyond the pale or old school and unsophisticated, or they come up with all of these other myths that it's racist or it's against women or it's Eurocentric and all of these other things. And so they focus instead on this radical theory because that's what's being promoted. And so I really wanted to mine down into the materialist basis for the promotion of certain types of theory that hoodwinked people like me and that have an enormous impact on very significant segments, I think, of the larger intellectual population, but of course it has an impact on organizing as well.
Actually, I think I certainly have a similar, at least intellectual trajectory in the sense that, when I was in graduate school, which is also in the early 90s, those were exactly the same things I studied. And but one of the reasons that I was attracted to it, and this might be a little bit different perhaps in the sense that because I grew up in Germany, I grew up with a strong critique, of course, of the East German and Eastern European system, and that was very deeply ingrained. But the thing is, and this just occurs to me, is that the dominant culture kind of wants us to think in this dichotomous way of anti-communism versus pro-communism. There's the pro-communists who are bad, and then there's anti-communists who are good. And to me, it seems like, and I just want to throw it out there and see what you think. I mean, maybe, we shouldn't be thinking in this kind of Manichaean way, this dichotomy of pro versus anti, but, recognize the errors and mistakes that have been committed in the name of socialism and communism and try to find something better, improve on what was achieved, and recognize the positive achievements, which were certainly, I would say, the tremendous amount of social equality and social justice that were achieved in those systems, but at the same time criticize or be able to criticize some of the abuses of power that took place, and that might help us also understand, that there were critics perhaps of that aspect, but they were then perhaps promoted because they were convenient for, and I'm particularly thinking of somebody such as Marcuse or so, it might have been received some support because they were perceived as being anti-communist or something like that, but actually they did have some kind of a larger critique that both of the West and of the East. What do you think?
Well, yeah. In the case of Marcuse, of course, he worked for the Office for Strategic Services, which was a predecessor organization of the Central Intelligence Agency, and then also was in, I believe, it was a State Department that had liaison relationships with the Central Intelligence Agency, and then worked for 2 CIA cutouts at Harvard and Columbia because the Russian institutes were basically founded by the CIA. So Marcuse does have a questionable past, to say the least, but he evolved in various ways. Drifted to the left, was radicalized, I think, by many of his students as well, like Angela Davis, and ended up definitely supporting, taking positions that were slightly different. Like he was against the war in Vietnam, unlike Horkheimer and Adorno. He supported some of the student movements, unlike Adorno and Horkheimer. So there are important differences there. But the larger point that you raise, I think, is an important one. I would phrase it, I think, slightly differently, but I take it that maybe we're going in a similar direction, and that is that one of the other projects that I've been working on is on an approach to socialism, actually existing socialism, that is dialectical. And that word doesn't have to be scary, right? Dialectical simply means, in this sense, that socialism as it exists in the real world is a process. And it's a process that emerges out of a capitalist world. So it inherits from capitalism. Racism, structural misogyny, exploitation, third world underdevelopment by the capitalist world, all of these problems that it has to try to solve. And it has to try to solve those problems very quickly and develop the productive forces so that the socialist country isn't crushed by the imperialist countries. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. It has, of course, led to complications, contradictions, mistakes along the way, things that, at least from the outside, you could look back on and say, hey, that seems like that was an incorrect path. But one of the really rich things about actually existing socialism, and here I'll give a shout out to the great Domenico Losordo, who has written poignantly on this, is that socialism is also a process of learning. So that as socialism develops, the Chinese were learning from the Soviet experiment, and people today are learning from, the Chinese of today are learning from mistakes that were made by Mao. And that whole process we have to recognize as being really integral to what it means to develop socialism in the actual world. There's no blueprint. It doesn't fall from the sky. Nobody knows exactly what will and won't work. Therefore, you have to try things out in practice, see what works and what doesn't work, and then address those mistakes. And so a central element in actually existing socialism is self-critique. And self-critique is really the lifeblood of so much of the global socialist movement. But that self-critique of socialism is very, very different than the kind of baked-in anti-communism of the kind of dogmatic and ideological Western, a lot of the Western intelligentsia or just the Western propaganda apparatus, which simply says that the communists are hell-bent on destroying, life as we know it and the planet Earth, which couldn't be further from the truth, right? So what we should do is look at actually existing socialism with sober eyes, not through the propaganda lenses that have been put on us by the U.S. national security state and many, many other forces. And that's really important as well for young people, because part of the radical theory that we're talking about, they never do that, right? I've read so many people who are self-declared Marxists within these traditions, if it be German critical theory or French theory. They literally know nothing about actually existing socialism. And if they cite a single source on actually existing socialism, those sources are pure propaganda, meaning that they are the figures who worked hand in glove with MI6 and the Central Intelligence Agency in fabricating pure propaganda about these histories. And so, again, we come back to the kind of, or I guess we kind of come full circle, because the approach to actually existing socialism that would be dialectical has to reject this very Manichaean approach that you get in radical theory, which says, well, there's nothing to be salvaged from this horrible thing. At most, we can just recognize it, as Žižek does, as a kind of intense death drive. No, on the contrary, we have to break with the binary propaganda line in order to scientifically engage in materialist research and look at what worked and where there were problems, not in order to throw everything out, but in order to address those problems. Because in the world that we're living in, the capitalist world, it is very clear that if we don't address those problems and continue this process of learning, it's going to be the end of the world as we know it due to ecological degradation, World War III, or some other apocalyptic end to the capitalist world, because that's obviously where we're headed.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And I just want to add, I think one of the aspects of the dominant culture that we live in is precisely to always kind of abstract from the historical processes and to look at everything as if it were somehow fixed in time. And that's why I really particularly appreciate your pointing out of the dynamic process in which socialist societies exist and develop. And I think that's absolutely crucial to keep in mind. But we're going to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Gabriel Rockhill, professor of philosophy at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. Thanks again, Gabriel, for having joined me on The World on Fire.
Thank you, Greg.
And thank you, our audience, for joining us as well. Until next time.